In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to The Convertsation, the TV program that discusses the issues, challenges, and daily struggles of converts to the religion of Islam. Thank you for joining me, Daniel Pizer, and my co-host, Sheikh Yahya Seymour, for another episode as we discuss the subject of conversion, both salvation and tribulation. Often, new Muslims see that immediately before and after their conversion, they received a lot of support and positive feedback from their community. But immediately after converting, when the real struggle begins, frequently a lot of that support can vanish as quickly as it appeared in the first place. Today we're going to discuss what are some of the broader challenges that new Muslims often encounter, and how can their faith communities provide them with support. We're also going to go over some messages that I've received from converts, dealing with some of the struggles that they've gone through or continue to go through related to their acceptance of the message and religion of Islam. Let me turn it over to Yahya.
Well, thank you, Shaikh Daniel, for having me here again as your co-host and for discussing this topic with me. I must admit, whilst I think that the topic you've chosen to discuss today between us is an interesting one, I just want to drop a quick objection I have to it, or reservation. I don't think I'd say objection. Objection is too strong a word. On the basis that I don't think every convert initially is welcomed in with a promise of salvation and a glorification for their conversion necessarily. Rather, some converts actually, depending on where the community is and whether or not it tends to be an ethnically diverse and even an active community, can find that the community is more like, well, why would you convert?
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is certainly the attitude I believe I experienced when I initially converted in Scotland. You had a tremendous amount of sons of immigrants, basically, who were extremely perplexed and just baffled by my decision to convert. And
that's fascinating. I definitely had a opposite experience. Tell me a little bit about yours, and then we can compare.
I mean, if you really want to go into it, as some of viewers may have heard in the first episode of The Convertsation, I initially converted at the age of 15. So you can imagine that was at a time when I was still at high school. As a result, I had many, well, not many, but a few Muslims in my high school. And it kind of went from, well, you're that guy we've seen in our high school. They might not have been in the same year or the same class as me, but they've seen me in my high school, thinking, wait, what's he doing at the mosque? You know, we're trying our best to not be brought to the mosque. Why is he coming to the mosque by choice?
So you mean you received that kind of reaction from the indigenous Muslim community, from your peer group, especially at that age?
Yeah,
which makes a lot of sense. In terms of at the masjid, what was the level of support in terms of leading up to your conversion or your conversion? Did you initially go to a center to ask questions and whatever? So you were ready to go as soon as you showed up.
In fact, I hunted down the community center primarily as a result of my desire to be an official Muslim, as opposed to just a Muslim that's recognized the theological beliefs and read the Shahada.
You wanted to be the card-carrying Muslim.
I guess, to put it this way, someone desires to cement their new identity as soon as possible. And for reasons like that, I was very keen to adopt an Arabic name, and that's a whole discussion for another topic. That's a whole topic for another discussion, namely whether or not converts should even change their names. Right?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of debate about this online as well.
Yeah, and these discussions were not really being had when I initially converted. I mean, it was just a given. It was like, so
what's your new name?
Exactly. So that was just the first reservation I had to your words. In regards to the second part of the topic, absolutely. I have genuinely found that even those who did tap you on the back and were like, we're here whenever you need anything, on Eid would be the last to call you on those times when you need some kind of, I guess we could say, moral and emotional support. On a day like Eid, when you're going to be feeling extremely lonely because you go to the Eid prayers and it's like afterwards, well, you know, what am I going to do now?
Would you say that you noticed a difference because you, if I'm correct, you took your Shahada at a Sunni center,
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
What would you say, if you've noticed any differences between how you might have been received at one of those centers versus a Shia center? Did you notice any differences, first of all? And
This is a controversial can of worms you're opening up here, Sheikh Daniel. And
yeah, I know, somewhat intentionally.
Kind of putting me on the spot as opposed to.
Let me give you my
know.
experience.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
When I converted, although I considered myself someone who converted directly to Shiism because
Yeah.
I didn't know where there were any Shia centers.
So you converted directly to Islam.
Yeah, exactly. This is what I tell people now.
Yeah.
It was not sort of a stages of progression thing for me in the
Yeah.
same way. Granted, and we can come back to this after that, it certainly becomes a bigger. The journey for knowledge sort of starts at that point.
Yeah,
I think,
absolutely.
even though you've done a lot of research leading up to taking Shahada or whatever else, that it's after that point that this sort of, I feel like the word abyss has too many negative connotations, but man, it's just this huge void that you have to fill with knowledge, which may be correct, may be incorrect. It's another subject as well. But when I took my Shahada, I went to the nearest place that I knew that was had a masjid, and it was, in retrospect, when I now look back, knowing more about different Muslim groupings, one that I would say falls definitely more into maybe sort of like the Salafi kind of
Wahhabi
leaning
tradition.
center. Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, they would never use that word, but of
No,
course,
of course not. But it's like,
no
it's
Wahhabi
like,
ever does.
It's like me saying that something's not a duck, it's a mallard. For synonyms, I mean, with due respect.
It's true. But I remember talking to, leading up to this, talking to the Imam of that center, who was a very, very bright young man who was maybe a couple of years younger than me.
Wow.
And he was taking over the center from his father.
Mm.
And also...
And they tell us they don't believe in hereditary succession.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of nice conversations with him.
Yeah.
I think that he was a really well-meaning person,
Sure.
and I remember.
Many people are, regardless of what faith tradition
Yeah, of
they
course.
come from.
Of course, yeah.
This is a
I don't
caveat we
want
need
to.
the viewers to understand.
It's true. No, I mean
Yeah.
but the image that you typically hear about like very hardline religious people,
Yeah.
I was not sort of what I expected. The more I talked to them and saw that he fell into a much more. I hesitate to use the word conservative tradition, but I guess that would be the colloquial way to put it.
Yeah.
That most people would understand. It was a bit of a surprise to me. So I remember talking to him about the Shia and him giving me this explanation about how, they worship 12 different gods and other things like this. And things actually I had never even found online as sort of bizarre accusations before. And I think he actually was confusing some of the myths together into new myths.
Wow.
that I hadn't heard. But I sort of played along. And but once I agreed that I would come back soon to take the Shahada, I remember going, and it was time for one of the Jamaat salats. And so he had me pray there, and then after that, do the Shahada in front of the whole audience,
Sure.
And this is a place that a lot of cab drivers go to. So the
Wow.
place is packed. It's at a very prime location for them as well to
That's
come.
excellent.
So it was very.
If you ever need a taxi in central New York, we know where
I
to
got
go.
a lot of cards afterwards, actually,
Yeah.
saying, if you need a ride, whatever, and the response that I got was extremely positive. I have never had that many people hug me before in my life.
Wow.
There was like a line going out of the center. It's what I feel like celebrities must feel or something. It was
Yeah.
really strange because I felt like this is not maybe a level of attention that I'm
Yeah.
comfortable with, and so. But it was an overwhelming experience and an overwhelmingly positive one, I would say. And a lot of people out of that crowd did come up and offer to give me their phone number, other things that if I needed any help learning how to pray, doing other things like this, that they'd be more than willing. And after that, I didn't really go back to that center very much. in part because of ideological differences and faith differences, and in part because I also was blessed enough to find a center in Brooklyn that was not much farther away that I was able to start going to, that was a Shia center.
Excellent.
However, I will tell you that months and months later, on the first day of Ramadan, I got a call from the Imam of that masjid, leaving me a voicemail, very politely, just saying he hadn't heard from me in a long time, hoped that I was doing well, letting me know that this was the first day of Ramadan, and giving me sort of a brief overview of what I needed to do for the month.
Excellent.
Essentially.
So essentially following up on the fact that you'd converted. Wow.
Exactly, and remembered my name and everything. You know, this I find for at least people who have entered. I don't want to be unfair to all Shia communities, but to a lot of them, that when they've entered those, that level of support is not necessarily there. Or that it's sort of like you going for swim lessons when you're a child, and they just sort of throw you in the pool and hope you can and swim. And then after that, you know, you don't really. It's just assumed you learn the rest on your own automatically or something. Yeah. Although I've certainly heard stories about people who've had difficulty with the same issues in Sunni communities. So I'm sure that it happens. Maybe I just got lucky, I don't know. But that's the reason I was asking if you see any differences, even looking back now, in how communities handle that. I'm raising the issue not to suggest that there's some inherent flaw in Shia communities, because otherwise I would have just gone immediately from Shiism to Sunnism, but
well, absolutely.
No, early on, I'm saying
we're merely talking about some issues which exist in our communities.
Yeah, but I think it's important for us to look at these things comparatively, whether it's between Shia centers or Shia and Sunni centers or whatever else, so that we can find out what the best way for those communities to be supportive of new converts is. That you have to learn from what other centers do right.
Absolutely.
And implement some of those things. So for me, the biggest thing, actually, that follow-up phone call was really touching, actually,
those things are absolutely very touching. And I can remember when I was I guess we could just refer to it as being a Sunni, for the sake of convenience. When I was a Sunni, which was for the first 2 years of my Islam, after converting at the age of 15, I did tend to find that the community was slightly more supportive than it is within the Shi'i dynamic. And what I mean by that is, yes, I'd find those guys who genuinely were religious, genuinely were interested in religion, and especially one good friend I had called Mehmet. He was very, very keen on insisting that, you know, he would regularly take me out for dinner with another convert brother, and even though we were from very diverse backgrounds and even had very different views of Islam at that time, he just tried to give a sense of what Islam teaches and be kind of a mentor for me, like a bigger brother type figure. And this was an extremely appreciated fact.
But isn't this something we should be learning from the early experience of the first Muslim community as well? That after the migration happened...
To be quite honest with you, with the exception of Imam Ali and Ahlul Bayt and about 30 of the early community, I don't really want to be learning anything from that generation.
I'm not saying the generation itself, but I'm saying from
how
what the Prophet
tried to
did
shape from you.
Exactly. That when he brought them, one of the first things he did was establish the system of brotherhood between them.
Yeah.
Right. And in to some extent anyway, that seems exactly like a program of mentorship.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I do think there is much that could be learned from the prophetic program as to how to shape a new community, especially since the community in the West is a new community. It comes from a particular dynamic. It no longer has the luxury of being a shaped community by years of culture, because they've left their comfort zone. They've left Iraq, they've left Pakistan, they've left all these other areas they once came from, are now in a diverse area. And that's one thing I found when I was within the Sunni community. Because they were so diverse, Pakistanis, Indians, Moroccans, Algerians, Jordanians, Saudis, Kuwaitis, it was so diverse that even people from like Bosnia and Albania, the Balkan regions, that they had to just stick to a program which was talking about key and core religious issues.
And met everyone's needs.
Whereas, since moving to London, not only is there an ethnic dynamic problem, but people will go as far as to justify it. So, for example, people will say, "No, of course we need a Khawaja center, or of course we need a Iraqi center, because Khawajas can't relate to Iraqis, and Iraqis can't relate to Khawajas, for example." And so, rather than try to remedy the problem, they'd rather pump loads more money into creating a center for one ethnic group and being like, everyone's welcome, of course, but you know, if
It's
you're a
meant to
Khawaja
serve
and
the
you want
needs of-
Khawaja
yeah.
culture, go to your Khawaja center. Expect Iraqi culture here. And so for poor converts, he's left feeling misplaced. He doesn't know what to do. And that's very much a feeling I have when I look at my experiences embracing the Shia community, especially when I moved up to London. I felt that, you know, no longer did you go to religious groups and find that people were fascinated as to why you converted. Yeah, fair enough, people might be like, so why did you convert? To make conversation.
Yeah.
But the people who were religious, sometimes it was very hard to distinguish between a genuine religiosity and a religiosity which stemmed from, well, this is part of my cultural identity.
Sure. I've also found it in a sense that maybe some people are welcoming in different ways, in that some you can sense that there's it's a very sort of sincere attitude.
Yeah.
And others, I get the sense, and I want to say that this is objective enough because I've heard this from enough people as well who've converted, that there's a level of suspicion or skepticism in the question
There
as
is
well.
definitely. There is definitely.
Not with everyone, but
I think
with some
that
people.
arises a lot more when it comes to, say, for example, marriage proposals, which would be a separate topic we can discuss at one point, of the convert, or even kind of friendships. Yeah, I do find, surprisingly enough, sometimes more educated first-generation immigrants to the UK will actually know how to engage with the convert better than their own children will. And I find that sometimes this is because their children don't even appreciate why they're religious, other than, well, my parents held that religion, and unfortunately it holds me back from doing the things in society that I want to. And that's one thing I find frustrating. But just to go back to the crux of the issue you raised, namely, what's the difference between being welcomed as a Sunni and being welcomed as a Shia? Well, put it this way, if I go to a Sunni mosque in a different city of Scotland in the past, and people would see me wearing a dish dasha, I'd often be raised with, "Oh, mashallah, brother, where are you from?" They wouldn't assume I'm a convert first, they'd ask where I'm from, because Sunniism's diverse enough that you can see a white person and think he's probably from the Balkans or something like that.
Exactly.
Or in my case, I happen to be mixed race, and so it's a bit difficult to tell. And once they'd find out you converted, they'd be like, "Oh, mashallah, why'd you convert?" Whereas, well, you've been with me for these experiences, so over here, we'll be wearing a dish dasha in a Shia Muslim bookshop in the holy city of Karbala, in the war-torn nation of Iraq, post-Saddam, post all these terrorism, civil war issues that Iraq has gone through. So, you know, it's rare enough that you might see a Westerner in Iraq, but fair enough. You might have a Westerner who's contracted as a worker with some company. To see him in a dish dasha is rare enough, but maybe, fair enough, in your perception, he might be there to try and just adopt the local dress for the sake of convenience. To see him in a Shi'i bookshop,
An Arabic language Shi'i bookshop.
in the Arabic language Shi'i bookshop, okay, you know, I think by that point you can kind of trust your logical instincts and assume this guy's probably a Shia. So you'll remember those times when you've spoken to a few people that can speak English, who will be like, "Oh, so you speak English?" And be like, "Yep." You'd be like, "Where are you from?" "I'm from Scotland." "You're from America?" And they'd be like, "Oh, and you're Muslim?" They'd be like, "Yep." "And you're Shia?" No, what was it?
Sometimes
one
they will
time
ask-
they actually asked if we were Christian. Was that not not right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's-
to which I responded yes, because most Christians are wearing dish dashas present in Karbala and in Shia Muslim bookshops.
No, the worst is when you get asked if you're Shia, and then after that they ask if you're Muslim, which is
That's it's particularly problematic when it's asked by particular people of prominence, but yeah, that's a topic for another day, I suspect.
We're just going to go to break now, and inshallah we'll be back in a few minutes. Welcome back from the break. What I was going to ask you before was, what do you think are some things that communities can, let me rephrase this, what would you like to tell communities, for instance Shia communities, about the convert experience that maybe they're not conscious of all the time? Because that's a big part of doing this show in general, but especially for new Muslims and early converts, in terms of mentoring or sort of keeping in touch and helping them integrate into the community, especially in a way that is accepting of a lot of aspects of their identity without requiring too much change.
Yeah, yeah. I think the first problem I would raise, or the first issue I would raise, or bring to their attention rather, is the fact that, and to be fair, I don't want to reduce this to a Shi'i issue. I think Shi'ism is just, as a social construct, as a community. I'm not talking about as a set of doctrines and jurisprudence. I think
absolutely.
Shi'ism is the ultimate truth, and nothing is going to bring you to Allah other than Shi'ism. But in regards to this particular point, as a social community, I would argue that one thing that Shi'ism needs to familiarize itself with, or Shias need to familiarize themselves with, is basic human psychology. The fact that we converts, just like any other human being, are social animals. We depend upon the ability to, basically, many people, when they joined Tashayyo, they joined Tashayyo looking for a correct, organized religion. An organized religion in the sense that many people were attracted to the concept of praying in congregation. They're attracted to the concept of communal worship. And so, when you remove the community from all of that, you've basically stripped Tashayyo into something which is not particularly a beautiful option.
Yeah, it becomes more of a nice idea.
Yeah, and what I find is, at times, it almost seemed like there was a deliberate attempt, and I know it wasn't deliberate, but it seemed like it at the time, to just put you off all forms of kind of communal action. What I mean by that is, I've already described as to how often converts, and you know this better than me, I mean, I live in the same student residence as you, and I've seen how the Muslim Shia brothers here deal with you, just because you happen to be so white. You'll be praying and people will just be keeping an eye out on you to make sure you're praying.
Or doing anything else.
Or doing anything else, like wudu. And so as a result, you have this internal psychological instinct that you no longer even want to pray in congregation. You don't want to be seen praying by people. They're just going to pick out small things. You don't want to be seen doing wudu in front of people because they're going to pick out small things, even if you're justified and are correct in your actions.
And the fact that that happens years after, that you still run into people who do this. I remember the first time I came for HOTBIRD, I had someone watching and correcting my wudu at one point, just randomly. Someone I'd never met before.
Absolutely.
Okay, inshallah, he was trying to be helpful. If he was genuinely trying to be helpful, hopefully he's rewarded for that. But
sometimes you do wonder. Sometimes you wonder: is he trying to be helpful, or is it
some people you can tell a little more? Yeah.
That is
even between converts, you can see this sometimes happen as well.
Absolutely. And I sometimes think that converts are shaped into nastier individuals than they might have potentially been
sometimes
by a desire to break the hierarchy that they were originally placed in. So for example, they felt they were at the bottom of the pyramid. Now a new convert comes in, they're like, here's my chance to kind of gain some street cred and boost my credentials and position in the hierarchical chain of the Shia community.
That kind of correction, I think, can be overwhelming for new Muslims because they're already trying to deal with an enormous amount of information, and I think that's something we'll probably get into in the next episode or a future episode, is sort of sorting through that. But given that there can be a flood of information like that, when someone is trying to get everything right, and it's a lot, it feels like a lot of things, your wudu needs to be correct for your salat to be established, other things like it goes on and on and on, just in terms of the fiqh, forget doctrine or anything else. So in a stage like that, that's when someone may be also the most sensitive to that kind of criticism. This is not to say the communities don't helpfully correct people or whatever else, but to some extent, the way that you'll avoid needing to correct them is by proper mentoring early on, and when you correct them, that's done in the right way and in an appropriate way.
Yeah.
And sometimes this means keeping other community members in check to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who can be either come on a little strong sometimes, even if they're well-intentioned, or can be trying to seem like they're, you know, the authentic Muslim and everyone else is sort of just there.
That's also.
So I guess one of my thoughts for communities and inshallah, if any community leaders, I don't just mean here the imams of centers or other things, but people who are connected, who get around within their communities and talk to people. One of the things that can be very beneficial is starting some kind of mentoring programs. This is one area, unfortunately, where I think, at least in the US, I don't want to say everywhere, but in a lot of areas, where the Shia community is actually much farther behind the Sunni community in terms of organized outreach to converts.
I think you're right, but let me just throw in a small observation as opposed to reservation I have on that point. I think that has in English, please allow me to rephrase that, within British English, the correct and the original form of the English language, we have an expression which is to say that could go pear-shaped. And that does not mean that is going to be like in the shape of a pear, the kind of fruit that we have. No, it just means that it could go disastrous. What do I mean by that? If, for example, you have a well-meaning community leader who starts this mentoring program, there's like, yeah, please, guys who want to become mentors to new converts, sign yourselves up on the board. And this becomes a free thing where whoever wants to put themselves forward as a mentor can kind of do that. That can go disastrous because you have a lot of well-meaning people out there who just are not qualified, even not qualified in terms of studying Hausa, but they don't even have a life experience or experience of dealing with other people socially to enter themselves into that
kind of program like this, that in terms of having it organized, is if you can configure the program in such a way that you essentially are training mentors. And this is more what I meant is that ideally, in some centers maybe this is not as feasible, but you have some kind of small program that begins with training a small number of mentors who can then work on training others. And this can be folded in to dawah and tabligh efforts and outreach in general as well, because I think it's an important part of that.
Definitely.
Then that could be very useful. What I meant by bringing up these other programs, in New York we have one very famous center in the city even for Sunni converts where you can go. They have classes, they have like a new Muslim program there that gives you sort of the basic stuff that you need to know in a way that's not necessarily going to overwhelm you, that will also sort of cater to the emotional support and community kind of needs, like you were saying before, that people who come to an organized religion, part of it is that organized part. You know, part of it is the community part of that, and so they can find that there at least. But they're also still encouraged to interact in other centers. A lot of the teachers come from other Sunni centers in the city.
Wow.
And they offer a lot of other things beyond that that are slightly more sort of advanced educationally in terms of Arabic or fiqh within other madhahib and this kind of thing. I'm not saying we replicate that kind of program, but some of them have certainly been successful, and I think it's useful for our communities to start looking into what's being done right in terms of retention of converts.
My heart's burning, Shaikh Daniel. My heart's burning. I need to just throw in my 2 cents here.
Sure.
You see, we believe the Ahlul Bayt are the ultimate truth and are the absolute path to Allah Azza wa Jal, and that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi came with nothing other than to teach us Islam as was practiced, taught and preserved by the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. And so when you have the other schools who are upon God only knows what, 124,000 Sahaba, all of them being a path to teaching Rasulullah's message, and one of them fights the other, and the other one kills the other, and it's radiyallahu anhu upon the killer and the killed. And yet they're so organized and so active in spreading this to the other people. This frustrates me. This frustrates me that they're upon some contradictory basis and foundations.
People with the wrong message can have the right approach.
But they treat it as if it's such gold, with such delicacy, as if it needs to be spread out to the masses, and successfully so.
It's true.
I mean,
they don't take their religion cheaply.
They don't take their religion cheaply. Whereas we have Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, we have Imam Ali alayhi salam, Imam Ali, who, if we were to take all the world's greatest thinkers and philosophers in the world and place them in a room with him, they couldn't touch him. And yet it's like, yeah, inshallah, just pat him on the back, he's converted. Now just abandon the poor guy.
Yeah.
You know, so these poor converts, it's as if they are swimming against the tide. They make it to the desert island. They're expecting people to come with food and shelter for them. And people are like, oh, you've made it onto the island. Guess we'll see you about then. And they just leave him there.
I think one of the reasons that may happen, we have in psychology, for instance, we used to call this, the nickname was the kitty Gennady's effect. It was based on a very famous case we don't need to get into in New York. The idea basically is that if you see someone in danger or who needs help, that if you're by yourself, you're more likely to help that person than if there's a group of people present. Because each person in the group either thinks someone else in the group is going to step forward to help, or they're waiting for them to do that.
I see.
So one thing I think might happen in some centers is that a lot of people offer support, or seem to at the beginning, and maybe they're sincere about that, but they assume that either because the person has not phoned them and said, hey, I have a lot of problems, I need help, or they haven't heard anything, that maybe someone else is helping them already, or this kind of thing. So, I mean, what I would say in general to viewers who are born Muslims or non-converts, whatever term you want to use for them, that it doesn't hurt to sort of gently pull someone aside and ask, are you getting everything that you need? Is there anything that I can help you with?
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
That kind of thing. And for converts, I would really very strongly encourage them to be vocal about the needs that they have. If you convert,
with the right people,
sure, with the right people, but if you convert, and I hear about this not all the time, but certainly enough that it seems like it's a thing.
Yeah.
I would say is people converting, and then sometimes even years later, not knowing how to pray properly, and knowing this, being aware of it, and that if with things like this, especially with very fundamental parts of the religion, to not be afraid to speak up and say, I need help learning to do this.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's not a dumb question.
No, it's not.
You didn't convert to the religion in order to not pray.
And in order to be embarrassed about the need to break that vicious cycle. No, absolutely.
So, to some extent, part of it is, on the convert side, maybe pushing yourself a little more out of your comfort zone than you already have, in terms of asking for help when you need it, but also getting directed if possible. I mean, usually, a lot of the Imam centers in the U.S., I don't know how it is in the U.K., they're extremely busy, and sometimes in the U.S. they're spread very thin. They may attend to a number of different centers.
Wow.
So it can be hard to...
Thankfully in the UK we don't tend to have that dilemma.
Because it can be hard to get access to them. If you can get access to them for a few minutes, usually after Jama'a Salat or something like this, you can ask them, I know that you're very busy. Do you know someone else in the community who's knowledgeable and who can help me out, who has some time to go over these things? For me, I remember I had to learn how to pray online, watching videos from a center in Michigan that went over just sort of the basics of Salat according to the school of Faith. And while that worked okay for me, it doesn't work for everybody. Some people need some kind of live instruction. They need to be able to ask questions about details of it, the prayer or fasting or other things like this, and sometimes why we do the things that we do.
Yeah.
For a lot of converts, this is a whole separate question.
Sure.
Since they didn't grow up with it, there's no mechanism that is just sort of going to say, hey, I converted to this, now I'm going to accept all of it part and parcel.
Yeah.
I also want to know why I'm doing why we do some of the things that we do.
Absolutely.
And a lot of those questions, they're difficult to get answers to. So, in terms of center outreach, I guess what I was trying to say was that the work needs to happen from both ends, essentially.
Absolutely.
That centers, on the one hand, need to, and people in the centers, their leaders or people who are influential in the community, imams of the centers, need to be conscious of some of the issues that are specific to new Muslims in terms of making sure that they receive support and whatever else that they need early on, in terms of learning basics of doctrine, of practice. And at the same time, that converts should also be able to continue to push themselves outside of their comfort zone like they did when they converted in the first place, because that takes a big leap. You know, I don't want to sound cheesy and say it's a leap of faith, you know, but to an extent it is. You're jumping into the unknown to some extent and being able to push yourself a little bit more.
Sheikh, I agree in theory, but I really think that this is a point of disagreement between us, whereas I'm going to say that just because the convert had to go through a hard time when he chose to convert, doesn't mean a poor soul needs to convert into the community and be told, just as you went through a hard time when you converted, be ready to go through a harder time now that you're Muslim.
I agree, and in an ideal world that wouldn't happen, but what I'm saying is
pragmatically
being able to speak up for your needs. If you need to learn how to pray,
yeah,
better ask someone in your center early on, find out from even the imam in that center, if they're too busy, who's someone who can help me with this, and have them arrange it, and not to be too bashful about it. And in most cases, I think you'll find that people are very willing to accommodate. If you find they're not, there's other centers in most cases. I can't say that for everyone, unfortunately, but we have to wrap up the program. I feel badly because we didn't get to some of the responses that we'd received online, so inshallah we'll pick that up
just like
in the next episode.
We need to get used to being ignored by us. And of course, just slightly ignored.
I hope so.
Train of thought. In the next episode, inshallah ta'ala, we shall go through those emails, and I'll place high priority on it and
make sure that I stick to it.
Well, we'll cover at the start actually, in order that we don't miss that out.
Yeah.
Inshallah ta'ala, I just wanted to end on this note, and this is mainly an advice to the community. When dealing with converts, just remember that they are indeed human beings like yourself. They have the same emotional needs. I think, to sound quite generic here, a general rule which could almost be taken for granted here and should be applied by all is that you should just treat others in the way that you yourself would like to be treated. And we can't put you into a situation where we say that you would convert to another religion, because indeed we hope that you would never leave the wilayah of Ahlul Bayt, alayhim salam, otherwise you would face eternal damnation. Rather, liken yourself to a new situation. You move to a foreign country, you go abroad by yourself for the first time, and you're in a community which has different cultural norms from your own. You stand out like a sore thumb because you might be a different skin color to the rest of people, and you might be unfamiliar with the language that they speak, other than maybe you might have a basic familiarity with it, but there might be some terms that you're unfamiliar with. Now, given you find yourself in that situation, would you like to feel isolated and alone? I'm sure you wouldn't. And therefore, my advice is to just implement this rule, treat others in the way you would like to be treated, and try and empathize with the situation that they are in.
That's it for this episode. Thank you for joining us on The Conversation. If you'd like to join the conversation, you can email us at converts@imamhussein3.tv, and that information will be posted on the screen as well. Assalamu alaikum.